Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216, and this is your second lecture for Chapter 3, and we're actually going to be working in the Integrated Codebook. I want to make sure that you realize that as you're listening to these recorded lectures, you can pause them, you can back them up, they're all in YouTube, you can listen to them as many times as you would like. Always, if you have any questions, be sure and contact your instructor. Now, this is what 3M looks like when you first open it up. And if we were going to use the encoder or we needed to use the grouper, this is where we would be working. But for our purposes, we're actually going to be working in the Integrated Codebook. So we would click on the red I-10. But I want to go into the Help tab before we get started. Nope, that's not where I want to go. I'm going to click in ICD-10. And I'm going to click in this Help tab. Now, you'll notice CM is for clinical modification, and we have the guidelines, we have the preface, and of course this is if you bought a paper book, the preface is the information that's included in the very front of that book. And then this is an MCC/CC exclusion list, and we'll talk more about that later. This is the procedural coding system, and we began looking at PCS in Chapter 6. We have 3 chapters that cover the procedural coding system, and we'll actually spend about 3 weeks on this procedural coding system. This is where your anatomy and physiology and your terminology really play a part. Now, the guidelines, remember that the World Health Organization creates ICD-10, and the guidelines for ICD-10 are found at the CDC website. And literally you go to that website and then you click the letter I, and it takes you to ICD-10 coding guidelines. PCS guidelines are found at cms.gov. So they're located in 2 different places. I'm going to go into the guidelines for CM. These guidelines, you'll notice that these are FY17. So the fiscal year for the federal government is October 1 of 2016 to September 30th of 2017. So these guidelines went into effect October 1st of last year. And they'll be in effect until September 30th of this year. Then we'll have the FY 2018 coding guidelines. When those are available, I'll put them in the course, and in one of our lectures, we'll talk about whether or not there have been any significant changes. One of the things that I want to point out to you is that if there have been changes, they're in bold text. And if they're underlined, they've been moved within the guidelines. So this is very important, because if you want to know if there were changes in the coding guidelines, you don't want to have to take the FY 2016 guidelines and compare them side by side to the 2017 guidelines to figure out what the changes are. You just would not want to have to do that every single year. So it's easy to look at these electronically and to scroll down and to see where the changes have been made. What we're going to be talking about in Chapter 3 is Section 1. And Section 1 is the conventions, the general coding guidelines, and some chapter-specific guidelines. We're going to be looking at conventions. And then we'll be looking at general coding guidelines. And then for chapter-specific coding guidelines, as we study these chapters, we'll be reading these guidelines. Now you can see that this is 114 pages long. And actually for this fall, I will have the 2018 guidelines printed, and they'll be sold in the bookstore, and they'll be a required book for this course. I think they're usually less than $10 for these guidelines, but if you would like to print out a portion or any of these, please feel free to do so. The guidelines are included in every chapter of your book, and actually for Chapter 3, if you look on page 45, at the bottom, you'll see the beginnings of these coding guidelines, and they're in the green boxes, and they're all throughout this book, because as we study the different chapters in this book, we study the guidelines that are specific to that chapter. Now, not all chapters have coding guidelines. And so if there are not any coding guidelines, then yay. Okay, so you can just see that most chapters in ICD-10 do have coding guidelines. Section 2 of the guidelines, selection of the principal diagnosis. This specifically is the UHDDS that we studied in Chapter 2. Reporting of additional guidelines we studied in Chapter 2. Outpatient services, we may cover that in HIM 225. This is the first year the textbook has not included the guidelines for outpatient services. These guidelines will either be in HIM 225 or they'll be well, they will be in HIM 225, possibly in your PPE. We'll see. So these are the Section 1, the conventions that we're going to be studying in this chapter. You can come, if it's easier for you to come into the guidelines and read them than it is in the chapter, please feel free to do so. And you'll notice that here under excludes 1, we have this bolded statement. So this bolded statement is actually a change in the coding guidelines from the FY 2016 to the FY 2017. So if I look at this, I can clearly see that there has been a change made to the guidelines, and this is new terminology. You can see that under 13 etiology manifestation, they have added the term if applicable. So that's new in these guidelines. If I come and I look at with, you can see that they have added new terminology here. And I can tell you this was a huge change in the coding guidelines as it relates to diabetes. And we'll go over that in that specific chapter. And then we have a new under this section, which is well, let me get back up here. The conventions for ICD-10. We have new, number 19, code assignment and clinical criteria. The assignment of a diagnosis code is based on the provider's diagnostic statement that the condition exists. The provider's statement that the patient has a particular condition is sufficient. Code assignment is not based on clinical criteria used by the provider to establish the diagnosis. So that's a new guideline added this year. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to take some time to show you when new coding was added. Under laterality, we have this big chunk of information here. There were a lot of changes in the coding guidelines in the fall of 2016 because there had been a moratorium on any changes. Usually you do not see the extent of changes to the coding guidelines that we're seeing here. This is the beginning of the chapter-specific coding guidelines. Chapter 1 in ICD-10 is certain infectious and parasitic diseases, and there are coding guidelines specific to the codes that and the disease processes that are in that chapter. And there were not as many coding guidelines that were chapter specific as there were other things. So anyway, that's a demonstration of the where the coding guidelines are, what they look like, how to access them. When we cover the chapter in PCS, we'll go over all of these as well. Now typically we're going to be working in the Diagnosis tab when we're doing diagnosis coding, and then we'll be in the Procedure tab when we're doing procedure coding. They both have an alphabetical index. However, in the Diagnosis tab we have a tabular, but in procedures this is called a table, and we'll study that more when we are in that chapter. They're structured quite differently. We also have a table of drugs and chemicals, and we'll be coding from that table. There's a specific chapter in the textbook that goes over the table of drugs and chemicals. This tab, external cause, we'll talk about that in 225. We have an entire chapter on external cause. I want you to notice something here. External cause has its own alphabetical index and its own tabular. And sometimes it can be confusing if you're in the external cause tab and you start looking up a disease process. For instance, if I try to put in appendicitis, you can see I get a pink bar here. Well, I haven't spelled that wrong. And so you have to get used to the fact that if you're not finding something that you think you should, check and see what tab you're in. So for instance, I'm in the external tab, so I have to come back to the diagnosis tab and actually put that in again, and then you can see that I'm going to get to the place I need to be in the alphabetical index. There is a neoplasm table. Next semester will be the first chapter that we cover. Will be in neoplasms, and we'll work extensively in this table. And then of course procedures, we start with procedures this semester in chapter 6. So we're going to go back to the diagnosis tab. And in your textbook, I want you to turn to page 46. And we have talked about the format. ICD-10 is divided into the alphabetical index, and then it's divided into the tabular and all the different tabs. When we look at form and structure, it's important to note that the structure of CM codes, it's very different from PCS. In CM, the codes are anywhere from 3 to 7 characters in length. You can't depend on the code that you find in the index. And for instance, I'm going to look at this Q83.8. You can see that that is a 4-digit code. If there are more than 3 characters in a code, there is always a period between the 3rd and the 4th character. So I'm going to click on this code, and we can see that this code Q83.8 is in blue, and that means it's a complete valid code. If I look at this code Q83, it's in red. That is not a valid code. I can't assign the code Q83. I need a more complete code. If we look at this code E72.04, again, it's in a category of E72. That's a red code. We can't use that. We have a subcategory of E72.0. Again, that's a red code. We can't use it. But we find E72.04 is a more specific subcode. It's a blue code, and we can use that code. If I click on aberration and then mental, you see that code is F99. That's a 3-digit code, and that's absolutely a valid code. There is not anything more specific, so that is a valid 3-digit code. And then I'm going to go to codes that are 7 digits in length. Now I want you to notice that I am in a category S02, and this is another thing that's very important. We use the number 0 and the letter O in this coding system. In the CM, we use a 0 and we use an O. They look very different. You have to be very careful when you're writing them. When I write a code, I assume that I am writing a 0. If I have a code that has an O and a 0, I always put a line through my 0, a sideways slash through my 0, so I can distinguish it from an O. When we're in the procedural coding system, it does not use the letter O. It only uses the number 0. I try to be very careful and distinguish between those two, but sometimes I slip up because it's so easy to look at that and say, oh, it's SO2 instead of saying S02. Looking at these codes, can you tell the difference? This is O00. The O's are very round, the zeros are more oblong. And so this is a category where we have an example of an O that's used with a 0. If I were writing that code, I would be putting a slash through my zeros so that I knew those were zeros and not O's. When you're doing your homework, do not mix them up. An O can't substitute for a 0, and if you write a code if you put in a code into your homework, it looks very different electronically from a 0, and I can tell the difference immediately because it looks just like this. So don't interchange. Get now into the habit of distinguishing an O from a 0, and don't interchange them because you cannot do that. So let's go back to what I was going to show you with these codes. Now you'll notice, gosh, this is red code land, isn't it? All of these are red codes. What on earth are we going to do here? Well, actually, if we click on one of these red codes, and you'll see this is S02.1, and then we have these more specific codes down here, but they're all still red. These are, every time they're indented, it's more specific. So if I click on this S02.101, here are my blue codes. And the reason that this 6-digit code is not the most specific code, you see that this is 6 characters. It needs a 7th character, and you can see the 7th characters listed here. I can move this down, I can see those 7th characters. But when I'm looking at this code, I have an instructional note here that says the appropriate 7th character is to be added to each code from category S02, and these are the 7th characters. So it just takes time working with these and looking at them and remembering that S means stop. And if you actually click on an underlined red code, it will show you all the possible blue codes. But I strongly suggest you don't click on one at the beginning of a category, that you go in as deep as you can into the subcategories to find the most specific code. It makes it much easier to use. On page 47, X is used as a placeholder in ICD-10 CM. So for instance, if I go down and look at some of these codes, any of these codes, you can see that this code, I'm in a category for an adverse effect, which is underdosing of a systemic antibiotic. And when you look at this code, T36.0X, well, this is a code that requires a 7th character. And there is the 7th character is an A, a D, or an S. So we have X is a placeholder in this code. So you can see that all of these codes have an X as their 5th character. And One of the reasons for this is that it's used for possible expansion. So they can actually go back and decide to turn that X into another identifier and then change that X into another character to add more specificity to the code. So the X is a placeholder. Okay, we're going to end this lecture here because we're at our 20-minute mark. And so your question for this lecture is, in the coding guidelines, how are new additions and changes to the coding guidelines identified when you're actually looking at the official coding guideline document? So again, when you're looking at the official coding guideline document, how can you easily identify additions or changes to that document from year to year? And that will conclude this lecture.